morning. I'm Qualle, Interim Director of the California Water Institute at Fresno State. I welcome you to day 3 of the CWI's Funding Water Infrastructure in San Joaquin Valley Summit. Today will be a panel discussion focusing on your questions from the previous 2 days' presentation. But first, here's a word from President Castro of Fresno State and our commitment to water in the San Joaquin Valley.
Hello, on behalf of Fresno State's talented students, faculty, and staff, welcome to the Funding Water Infrastructure in the San Joaquin Valley Summit, hosted by the California Water Institute at Fresno State. As we all recognize, the status quo for water resource management in the San Joaquin Valley is not sustainable, and we must work together to identify and implement lasting, sustainable solutions that benefit all stakeholder groups. Nearly 5 years ago, I received the recommendations from a water task force that I had appointed to help guide the direction that Fresno State should pursue to engage more deeply on water issues in our valley. This summit and the work that will follow is a demonstration of my commitment to apply the resources of Fresno State to assist in crafting and shaping the water policies that will benefit our region's agricultural economy, disadvantaged communities, urban centers, and environmental resources. We are all in this together. Here's what we want to know. Are we at Fresno State doing the work you believe needs to be done to address our water issues? We strive to be action-oriented, operating in the real world with stakeholder groups to identify and implement practical and long-term solutions. I have no doubt that if we work together across all stakeholder groups, we can successfully address the water challenges that lay before us. Fresno State is prepared to strategically invest our intellectual and physical resources in cooperation with you to identify sustainable water resource management solutions for the entire valley. Thank you for joining us by participating in this important discussion. We look forward to working with all of you and other stakeholders throughout the San Joaquin Valley to improve water resource management for everyone.
Thank you, President Castro. Now here's Laura to explain how today will go and introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Codie, and thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. Today will be a little bit different from the other 2 days because we'll start with a short presentation that will provide a summary of the last couple of days, and then we'll follow with a panel discussion with some of our key presenters. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions on Slack during the last couple of days. Some of those questions will be used for today's panel discussion, and if we didn't get to your question, our CWI staff will make sure to follow up with you. Many of us wish we were in person and able to network with each other. This virtual world is a little different, but I hope and encourage you to interact with one another on Slack today. Today's will follow from a presentation, and then we'll take a couple of breaks, one right after the presentation and one sometime in between the panel to give the panelists a break, and as well as you. So I will start with a presentation that I'm going to go really fast because I'm trying to summarize 7 presentations into one. And so just bear with me. Our presentations will be, all of the last 2 days will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So if I went too fast in one of these presentations, you're welcome to rewind it and check it out on our YouTube channel. Okay, so we started on Tuesday with Amber. Amber provided us a historical economic background on the conditions of the San Joaquin Valley. She told us what a lot of us know is that the valley is unique and we mainly produce food for the nation, and some of that has caused social and economic challenges. We are the center of the food production, and we're seriously impacted by water infrastructure and a decline in potential agricultural production. She also showed us that there's been a historical correlation between the poverty level as well as the ag production in the last several years. Following her was a presentation from Dr. Sunding. Dr. Sunding presented the economic impacts that the valley will have due to scarcity of water. He mentioned to us that total farm water loss will be about 17 million acre feet due to just multiple things: lack of surface water supply, groundwater regulation, and that the valley farmers will probably lose about roughly 22% of their access to water. The water will be reduced and will cause a significant impact on our economy. But he also talked about just how it's going to affect the economy in general, as well as employment and annual income to the valley. We will lose jobs, we will lose economy throughout, and it'll affect the entire state, not just the valley. It'll preliminary impact the valley, but it will have statewide impacts. He mentioned that there's a few ways that we can mitigate some of these things. Some repurposing of some of those lands that will have to be fallowed, and new ways of trading water, and then bringing new supplies of water to the valley, and reclaiming some of the agricultural water use. To help with some of those mitigations, we had Scott Hamilton, and he told us a little bit about just the water blueprint that's being developed for the San Joaquin Valley. This plan is focused on encompassing all of the area's water impacts and not just one. There are significant changes that we'll have to make to help farms, disadvantaged communities, as well as the environment. And this blueprint intends to encompass all of those. He also mentioned that there's 3 key steps that will need to be taken to help mitigate some of these. And the first one is just to understand the problem. What is the lack of water going to do to a lot of our areas? And what is the estimated water depletion that we're going to have? The second step is to figure out what is sustainability, water sustainability, and for groundwater. What are the highs, flows? What are the lows? How can we reclaim water, as well as how will this impact the delta flows? And that we make sure that we're friendly to the environment. The third step he recommended includes new conveyance throughout the valley to be able to more easily move water from one place to the next. But all of this will take money, and will have a lot of capital investment, and will cost millions that will impact the entire valley. To tell us a little bit about how we can, how we have traditionally funded some of those expenses, because it's a pretty high number. Ellen Hanak told us a few of the traditional ways that we have funded infrastructure in the San Joaquin Valley. She mentioned that at the federal level, there's been about a 3% investment, 12% state. But if you see from her slide, 85% has traditionally come from the local level. She followed that with telling us a little bit about how the state has used bonds to help fill in some of those gaps, but traditionally that expense was not more than $1 billion. And as Scott mentioned, this will take about $9 billion. And these bonds have not always passed. Following that, we heard from Thomas Esqueda on what are some of the new ways we can possibly fund some of this infrastructure. And he started his presentation by mentioning a little bit about the blueprint again, that it's a lot of these infrastructure issues can be fixed with a one-time investment, but it'll take 40 years, and it'll take investments from both from everyone, the federal, the state, and as well as the water users and sales tax. He provided a photo of what some of those infrastructure changes can be. And he followed that with a presentation on what it would cost on some of those, specifically to each one of those areas. He followed that with a presentation on the activities and how that would happen in the next 10 years, as well as what the expenses would be for each of those, totaling about $7 billion for all of that infrastructure needs. That followed with where can some of that money come from, and how much of it, from water surcharge, from greenhouse gas funds, state and federal matching grants, as well as a debt financing. And the debt financing, he went on to explain that it would mainly come from revenue from sales tax. And he provided an overview of how that would happen in a 30-year loan, and what those expenses, a little more detail on what those expenses would be. He followed that with, especially with the crisis we're going through right now, we see that the debt financing would have different impacts due to a decline in the economy. And so his model presents how some of that will be affected and how it will intend to increase. He also gave us just a brief summary on how that would impact some of the low income residents because of the addition of the special sales tax. And we estimate that the increase in a special sales tax would cost about $11 per family for an average medium household income. So to learn a little bit more about how would people vote for special sales tax or the surcharge, we had Lisa Bryant talking about a survey that it's currently in its preliminary stages, and she provided some of the data that she's learned so far. So the purpose of the survey was to get an idea of what the people in the Valley's view is of water supply. We wanted to gauge their support for an infrastructure program, as well as gauge their willingness to pay for improvement through taxes. One of the questions that was asked was, which of the following do we believe that's most effective at addressing concerns about water supply? And she addressed a few of those, and she separated them by totals as well as Democratic and Republican. And just to, I don't think I mentioned, but she mainly polled potential voters. And so these were how the numbers came up on that section. She asked like who should pay. And so we have a variety of different responses, with the majority being the state government. She followed that with questions on who should pay the balance, because obviously that's not going to be enough. And if there was the farmers only, how would that be separated? If the residents were the ones to pay for it, how would that be separated? And then she had a question specifically about the sales tax, and we estimate that there's a need for a 0.5 or 0.5 cent on the dollar special sales tax to do this work. And here's how they're likely to vote. And we asked, will this change in a good economy or in a bad economy? She followed that by the concerns on how the sales tax would affect some of the different areas. And these are some of the specific concerns. The summary of her presentation was that there's a broad consensus that water supply and ag play a key role in the San Joaquin Valley, that there needs to be strong support from regional organizations and that include all the stakeholders, that the special sales tax will take key messaging to make sure it's passed. And those that are vulnerable or to job or loss are willing to support this, but it will take bipartisan, it might take some opposition. Both Tommy and Lisa talked about the need for a government strategy. And to do a little bit of that, we had Tom Holyoke from Fresno State join us in giving us a bit of an explanation on what that governing body could be. He discussed just the principles of a governing a governing structure, and how it has to be beneficial to everyone, and it has to be spread wide all over all of the jurisdictions. He talked about the cost burden and how that should fall on those that need the water the most, and but the repayment burden should be on some of those other that are concerned. He gave a brief explanation on some of the governing structures and how the voting could be, and how it would be weighted by the different stakeholders, and how they should be focused on capturing, storing, and that the focus should be a very holistic approach that includes capturing, storing, and conveying water. He went on to discuss JPAs and how some of those work. And following, he talked about the JPA structures, and specifically an EIFD and how those could work, and that it has to be a 45-year term and must have voting, and especially from all of the jurisdictions that will benefit from all of the new infrastructure. He mentioned that the governing board what the authority it would have, again, and I think that we heard this throughout several of the presentations. This plan has to be holistic and include all of the different areas that are affected by the reduce in water, as well as having and the JPA should have an advisory committee that provides feedback, and it makes all of it very transparent. So sorry if I went really fast. I was trying to cram 7 presentations into a short period of time to give us enough time to interact with the presenters. So we'll be back shortly and enjoy some time listening to the Fresno State Jazz Band. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our jazz band. For today's panel, we want to welcome back some of the presenters from the week, from the last couple of days. I believe David was going to be was called away for a last minute thing, so he might not be able to join us this morning. But Scott, Tommy, Ellen, and Tom, welcome back. I have a few questions, and they're not meant to be for one or another specifically. I like to encourage an interaction between all of you, and just take up whichever of you feel that you have an answer to that question. Feel free. So the first question is related to some of the repurposing of the land. There was a conversation on the Slack workspace about the word fallowing, and that the idea, instead, we should say that the land will have to be repurposed, possibly incorporating public-private partnerships to promote healthy soils, groundwater recharge, ecosystem enhancement, renewable energy projects. There was even a concern about the particles in the air and the health of our air quality that happens because of high winds during dried areas. Can some of the panelists please address what could be done to promote or research land use planning for a variety of options instead of following and avoiding knee-jerk reactions such as suburban development?
Laura, I'm happy to kick off on that answer. So I think, you know, I'll just start by saying, I think everybody that I've talked to across the valley over the last several years about this issue would like to see as little fallowing as possible. And, you know, in order to make that happen, that's about bringing in additional water supplies to help get groundwater balance. But the fallowing piece comes in to the extent that there's also going to be a need to do some demand management. And the key way to manage agricultural water demand in terms of bringing groundwater basins into balance is to reduce acreage. That's kind of the way the math works. And so folks that I've talked to across the valley, sort of when they think about that, the concerns that come up are, if that happens in a kind of haphazard way, you can have some negative impacts. You can have negative impacts in terms of, you know, if the land is just kind of left there to grow weeds, that can create pest pressures for neighboring farms. That can also, that can be a high wildfire risk in dry seasons. And then the alternative way that folks often will manage fallowed lands is that they'll disc it in order to reduce the pest pressures and kind of, you know, keep the land from causing impacts on neighboring farmland, but that then poses issues of dust. So folks have been worried about this. I know that the Regional Air Board has been starting to have conversations about this because of some of the board members from the different counties raising this question. So the challenge for the Valley is to really think in a creative way about how to repurpose these lands in ways that minimize those kinds of negative impacts and maximize the benefits. And we've done some preliminary look at this to kind of see, okay, what are some of the options and what are some of the funding pools available for that? And when you think about repurposing, you're thinking really, I agree, it's not just leaving the land to do nothing. It's really more about how to get best value out of land that's no longer irrigation. And there are, you know, some ways that that people can get multi-benefit approaches, apply multi-benefit approaches. Some of these lands can be used for recharge and create intermittent wetlands. You see some examples of that already in places like the Kern Water Bank. There's potential for more of that across the valley. There's potential to do some riparian corridor habitat on some of these lands. There's also potential to do some conservation-oriented approaches that can improve the habitat for the native San Joaquin, what are called the San Joaquin desert species, you know, kit fox, various kangaroo rats, and so on, various plants. There are some examples of that in some places in the valley already. There's tremendous potential in the valley for solar energy. In fact, new research shows that the San Joaquin Valley is one of the best places to do cost-effective utility scale solar. And as California continues to up its game on electricity, electrification of its power sources and going toward clean energy for its electricity, the valley has just a lot of potential there. The key with that is kind of doing that in ways that can also potentially get you other multiple benefits, doing that in habitat friendly ways, and folks figuring out how to do that. And then there's sort of a question of, okay, if there's going to still be some land that's not, that doesn't fit into any of those categories that I talked about, are there possibilities for what folks sometimes call rotational fallowing, where you're pulling land in and out of irrigation and you're managing the lands in the years when they're not being irrigated for major crops in ways that are improving soil health and improving the ability of the soil to capture water retention, and also at the same time minimizing dust and weed impacts. And that's an area where there's a lot of interest by USDA. And in the latest Farm Bill, there's quite a lot of emphasis on that kind of approach. There hasn't been as much research. You know, the person asked the question about research. Hasn't been as much research on what works best in a good way in dry areas like, you know, especially the southern part of the valley. I think that's an important area for research, along with looking at how to manage air quality and get these multiple sort of solutions that get these multiple benefits.
Thank you, Ellen. And before I moved on to Tom Holyoke, give me 1 second to welcome Dave Sunding. Glad you were able to join us.
Yeah.
We are going to do this very fluid, we intend for this to be an interaction. So the question currently is the options for, instead of saying fallowing, but repurposing of lands. So Tom?
I was just one observation. I assume a lot of the land that we would be talking about is in private ownership, farmland owned by specific individuals or specific companies. So the government agencies that we've been kind of talking about bringing into existence, whether it's a JPA or some other kind of agency, if the idea strikes that would those agencies then be able to spend some of the money they would be collecting on either purchasing this land or at least leasing it for some of the kinds of purposes that Ellen just laid out. I mean, it seems that that could become a part of what we are talking about when we talk about creating these agencies. In fact, I think even in some of the ideas that Tommy was promoting, there were some ideas of that in there. Some of the advisory committees that these organizations could come up with could be about land purchase and what to do with those kinds of lands, or even what can be done with some of the benefits that may still be on those lands. If it's solar, the potential for solar power, the potential for habitat restoration, or some of those lands may even have very junior water rights, otherwise they probably wouldn't be fallowed, but there could be some years when those lands may actually qualify for water. Maybe that water could be acquired and repurposed. Just some ideas.
Thank you, Tom. Scott?
Thanks, Laura. So first of all, Alan, thank you, really great summary there. Mind. So the blueprint has started to think about the environmental vision and how we would repurpose this land in a way that really makes some sense. Initially, we have identified close to about 900,000 acres that would be sort of in this repurposing plan. Some of that is already fallow, some that's already protected, but we're really trying to sort of develop this environmental vision for the valley. And this plan will take decades to implement, but we have started to reach out to some of the NGOs. You specifically mentioned the upland species, and the Nature Conservancy has this very interesting program to preserve about 50,000 acres for upland species in northern Kern County. So all of that's sort of fairly exciting, and it's going to evolve over time and address a lot of those concerns that you had raised. In terms of governing these, managing these lands moving forwards, that's sort of an interesting topic. One of the really common approaches that seems to be fairly popular is the use of land trusts. And so as we sort of, to the extent that we, that there is land that we want to like permanently repurpose, then if we can utilize some of these sort of existing management strategies so we don't just like repurpose the land, but we've got an ongoing management system to maintain its sort of beneficial use, then I could see sort of a vision in the valley where we really try and restore a lot of this historic habitat that we've lost.
Thank you, Scott. David, in your presentation, you had one of your last slides talked about mitigating strategies and some of what we can do to make up for some of the losses that we'll have in water. Can you tell us a little bit about how some of those not necessarily would be fallowed, but will have repurposing of the land?
Sure. Well, I think, probably all of the ideas that I talked about in my presentation, people have talked about today, and everything from, potential for some renewable energy projects, although I think that might be, that would be only a small fraction of all the area that could be fallowed. To me, the more interesting opportunities are in some habitat restoration, both upland habitat, and then habitat in areas that might potentially be used for more groundwater recharge. There's, I think, some very interesting possibilities there. And, maybe some alternative land uses, whether it's housing or commercial development or some, some other uses. Valley's clearly going to continue to grow, and there might be some conversion. I think the important thing is that the process is managed, that we don't end up with like a Swiss cheese phenomenon where there are patches of fallowing put together in a way that doesn't lead to a very efficient land use. And I'm sure people have talked about it, but one worry here that has come up in other areas where I've worked on fallowing programs, like the Imperial Valley, but also the Owens Valley, air quality is a real concern. The valley already has an issue with air quality. And when you're talking about fallowing, potentially on the magnitude of several 100,000 acres or more, there is a real concern about exacerbating air quality problems. So I think that would have to be carefully managed, no matter what direction the land use authorities decide to go.
Any other comments on land repurposing?
I'd just add, Laura, maybe, in terms of thinking about the financing and, kind of getting both to Tom's point about, this is going to be landowners and sort of how Scott and Tommy have been thinking about the strategy and the funding of this, that one of the important stakeholders on this is also going to be local governments from a fiscal perspective. One of the things we've heard in a lot of conversations with county officials is, a fear that, okay, as land comes out of irrigated production, what takes its place, and what does that mean for the sort of flexible funds that counties have from property taxes? Because a lot of the money that counties get is inflexible money that's from the state or the federal government for a very specific program, and property tax revenues kind of give a bit of flexibility. And this is clearly a concern when it comes to moving water around. We talked a little bit yesterday about water trading, and if it might make sense for the valley's economy to move water from one county to another to put it on lands that are going to be generating the most income and the most jobs. But if that has an impact on the county where the water's moving from, they're not going to be as comfortable with that, and there's going to be resistance. So thinking about ways to, in the strategy of not having Swiss cheese, of kind of making sure that important concerns are addressed. And one of them relating to solar energy right now is that there's a property tax exemption on solar generally, and that was sort of something introduced to help boost solar energy development some time ago. And probably we need to think about whether that still makes sense, or if it does still make sense, should it be valley counties that are hosting the solar on their lands that are taking that fiscal hit, or should that be distributed in a different way to energy consumers?
Thank you, Ellen. So if I heard you guys right, there's a multiple options of groundwater recharge and habitat restoration for some of these repurposing of the land. But also, in my view, these projects are going to need water to get to them and go through them. But where's this water coming from? I mean, where is the water that is going to recharge some of these areas? We already have a limited surface water supply, and so we're going to create all of these projects that need water. Where is this water going to come from?
Ellen had mentioned water transfers, which seems to me the more practical way of doing it. I imagine that, and I don't know this, but I would guess that a lot of the land that's going out of production reflects what David was saying in terms of Swiss cheese, that it's kind of going out as a result of issues of water rights and other contractual issues, and that to create a more holistic approach to managing the land that's being followed, you probably would need to transfer water. Now, how that sits with rights, I do not know, but it sounds like that only the ability to really move water around, even some kind of water market, it's the only way we can take a really kind of holistic management approach to dealing with this situation.
So Tom, let me disagree with you there. Sigma, it seems to me, is that it's actually going to impede water transfers. Just like Ellen was saying, it makes everybody very parochial, and there's going to be no water sort of leaving areas until that area has sort of achieved sustainability itself. And so while, I'm an economist like Ellen, and I very much believe in sort of the market system here, but in this particular case, I just don't know that it's really going to work. In terms of the new sources of water, we touched on that yesterday. Clearly I think people will be trying to grab the local high flow sources of water that are available to them. And as someone mentioned, I forget who it was, that water is sort of being double counted a lot in the GSAs or the GSPs. And so that then takes us back to that delta supply, the high flow delta water that where we've got 10 million acre feet a year going out to the ocean. What we need to include in our plans that you touched on, Laura, is we need to make sure that we don't just have enough water for agriculture, we've also got enough water for the environment. There's important habitats that we would need to really try and restore here, like riparian habitats and both seasonal and permanent wetlands. And so that, and including sort of water for wildlife refuges and water for duck clubs that also provide multiple benefits. So at the moment, we haven't got there yet, but that's one of the things I think we need to be focusing on moving forwards.
Anyone else? So both Ellen and David mentioned water transfers. And as we saw from the graphic that Scott had yesterday, there's a few proposals on how to include new canals so that we were better able to move some of that water around as we investigate water transfers. So is it okay to assume that the current infrastructure to use to move and store water it's currently at capacity? And climatologists tell us that precipitation will come less in the form of water, and less in the form of snow, and more in the form of rain. And so if so, are there specific needs to expand the capacity of the system to be able to move this water around in wet years?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that first, if that's okay. I think there are some interesting possibilities out there. I think expanding the capacity of the Delta Mendota Canal would be something that might facilitate groundwater banking. I think we don't yet know the benefits of that, but I think it's an interesting idea. Groundwater banking, what it would allow us to do is take more water out of the Delta during very wet periods, put it underground, and then that could help relieve some of the pressures that Sigma and underlying water scarcity are creating. The other bit of infrastructure that I think is intriguing is, we think a lot in California about north-south conveyance, and that's historically been incredibly important. But in the Valley in particular, I think some possibilities for east-west conveyance might allow us to move water around in a way that's more flexible and could support the development of water markets. So again, I know a number of people, including our group, have studied some east-west conveyance possibilities. But those are just a few examples of some infrastructure that might be worth taking a close look at again.
I'll just sort of follow on to what David said, just with a concrete example where you've got east-west capacity is in Kern County, and in Kern County, water is managed more flexibly than anywhere else in the Valley, and that's there's an ability to move it back and forth between the two north-south canals, local moving water around, and some of the groundwater sustainability plans down in Kern are looking to kind of add some additional nodes to that, and thinking about kind of having that ability further north it's time to really look at that seriously.
Yeah, I would agree, Ellen. No, and I think that's sort of where we were hitting at yesterday or on Tuesday with some of those blueprint ideas. There are some critical areas that there's just not enough east side water to get, to serve those needs. And so we really are going to need, I think, that east to west or west to east capacity there. And even in Kern County, so let me back up a little bit here. I don't think we need to expand either the Delta Mendota or the California Aqueduct. And I think if we tried to do that, I think that would give a lot of people in the Delta, heartburn. And they'd be very concerned about, what that might mean. In these very wet years, once San Luis Reservoir fills, typically we're in a situation in the winter and spring where the rainfall has really reduced demands throughout the state. The irrigation demands haven't kicked on yet because it's still winter and springtime, and because we've had a lot of rainfall. So once San Luis fills, essentially we've got a lot of surplus capacity in the two major canals coming from the Delta. There's a few thousand second feet that's going into Kern County for the recharge projects there. There's a little bit of water going into Southern California to top up reservoirs. But for the most part, there's a lot of surplus capacity sitting in those canals. And that's really what we're relying on. And one of the reasons why the Blueprint project isn't more expensive than it is that we're capitalizing on that unused capacity that's in those reservoirs. So then I think, even the capacity that we've got in Kern County with the Cross Valley Canal and the Kern Waterbank Canal is not enough to fully utilize the recharge capacity out there. So even in Kern County, I could see that we could do with some more west to east capacity, but it's going to be really important in areas like Madera and Tulare to get that east-west capacity built into the system.
It sounds to me like a lot of these projects are very brick and mortar intensive, new canals, expansion of dams, and new dams. Is there a thought that we could use existing natural waterways that are currently dry, or we've diverted and now are not in existence, but could be updated to be part of this infrastructure plan?
So Laura, I don't think we can, so, you know, the natural of water in the valley is from east to west. And what we're really needing right now is west to east conveyance. So it really doesn't, these systems don't really work for, to solve the real problems that Sigma has created here. The valley has an enormous and complex system for distributing water from east to west. And it's really just fascinating to study. And I think we want to utilize some of those areas now as recharge areas and create some dual benefits with riparian habitat and that sort of thing. But I see those older facilities as really helping with new sources of water into the valley. They just flow the wrong way.
Interesting. Anyone else on that subject? So in the last couple of days, as well as today, we talked a lot about all of these projects and how it's a long-term effort. And the projects are going to take a while to form a list of the projects, as well as financing mechanisms, and it's all going to take years. Ellen mentioned shovel-ready projects, but what is the time frame for a shovel-ready project? Is that 2 years, 3 years, and how long until the valley can see benefits from some of these projects? And just following up on that one, how do these shovel-ready projects fit into the larger plan?
So Laura, maybe I'll start just to kind of follow up, clarify a little bit more what I meant. When I was talking about shovel-ready, I was thinking specifically about in the context of the current recession. You know, most of the federal funding so far has been really on sort of emergency response issues, but there is a lot of discussion about also economic recovery funding that may come along, including for, you know, infrastructure is one of those areas that people look to for that as a way of kind of boosting the economy, and water is part of that conversation. Typically for things to serve that purpose, they've got to kind of be able to get off the ground pretty quickly. So that was certainly a requirement during the last recession. There was the ARRA, infrastructure funding, American Recovery, I don't know, I can't remember what the other R was, act, and it brought a lot of dollars to the states for infrastructure projects. They kind of had to be on the shelf and ready to go. So that's why we saw a lot of road repaving, for example, because that was like super fast to get done. In water, we saw a lot of money going toward wastewater facility upgrades, water treatment facility upgrades, the kinds of things that are already where there's a capital plan and there's a project and the environmental approvals are pretty much ready to go. And so that's where there are probably some things in the valley that could qualify for that. I'm guessing maybe something like the Frank-Kern Canal, where there's already been a lot of work done to figure out how to do it and you know, sort of the details on it. Whereas sort of something along the lines of what Scott was presenting yesterday for the, you know, a new vision for how you'd bring water through the Delta, that's not going to be on that list. It would be my bet.
Now, if these are quick and shovel ready, it seems to me like it's what we've always done. We patch things here and there, but we're not looking at the holistic view that Scott's been mentioning. So how will we make sure that some of those projects are part of the larger picture?
Yeah, Laura, I think that's what we're really trying to do in the blueprint. Like I said, the blueprint's more of a process than a plan at this stage. I love what the PPIC has done. I am like just so impressed with their productivity and and the amount of thought they can bring to some issues here. So well done to Ellen and the rest of your group up there. In terms of, so certainly I'm thinking in terms of shovel-ready projects, restoration of existing conveyance capacity, and there's several canals where that could come into play. The conversion of farmland to recharge ponds would be another one that has very minimal environmental impacts, and we could move pretty quickly on and could really help capture some of that high flow water. And if the reclamation projects out there, they, if the technology is ready, then there are also projects that would fit into that blueprint. And this is going to take a while and need a lot of input from a lot of different people, but we are trying to put together a holistic approach that addresses water needs for disadvantaged communities, addresses and promotes an environmental plan and a water plan at all levels, right? So it's water supply, it's water conveyance, it's recharge and other beneficial uses. And that's just going to, like Ellen said, that is going to take years, right? It's like yesterday, you know, what the time frame was there, and I sort of responded back with like 10 plus years, and that's probably optimistic, right? When you think about how much stuff we've got to get through. So this is going to be an extended process that's going to require commitment to get through it.
David, so you talked about the economic impact and how we can mitigate some of these. How long do you think some of these projects will take for us to see a benefit? Do you think it just depends on the project, or do you think if we go all out and focus on some of these things, will we see a return on some of those by getting water in the valley quick? Or what are your thoughts on some of how we can mitigate some of those impacts and some of those losses?
Right. Well, remember, you know, Sigma implementation is going to take place over a fairly long time period, right? So we have time if we start now with some good planning and identify some projects with funding. We have time to mitigate impacts on roughly the same time scale on which they'd occur. So that's the first thing to notice. And there are also some kind of, you know, what I would characterize as being almost like no regrets actions that we could take right now. Things to improve the flexibility of water management within the valley that would help in the short term. But to me, like, I'm happy to see efforts like the Blueprint and other initiatives that are thinking ahead now while we still have time to get some infrastructure built if that turns out to make sense.
We haven't heard Tommy this morning. Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, this has all been great. I mean, there's a lot of smart people on this call, so I'm just, I do think, you know, on the repurposing of the land idea, I think that, you know, back on that one, you know, we repurpose land right now on the valley floor. If you think about a grower going from citrus to nut, or, you know, nut to vineyard, or, you know, because the economics make sense. It's just that the economics make sense to do something different. We see it when a grower converts his land to an urban purpose, gets annexed. It's kind of, hey, the economics work. I'm going to go ahead and repurpose this. Now it's going to be a subdivision. So we got to really figure out, how do we create an economic model that is attractive to folks to convert their land to habitat, solar, whatever, that, you know, makes sense for everybody. So I think it's the economic model we got to kind of figure out, but we got to do it. The footprint's going to shrink, so if we be smart about it, I think that would be great. I think on the time commitment, you know, the time requirement, I think you could do it in 10 years if you had, you know, 3-4 years up front where everyone kind of came together and said, okay, here's the vision, here's what we want to accomplish, we agree to work together. So I think you're probably 3 or 4 years on the front end, but once you commit, you can get a program like this built in 10 years. But it's going to take, you know, a lot of effort, a lot of work. So I think that could work. On the water supply, I was interesting to listen to that one, because I mean, it's water through the Delta. I mean, so we got to figure out how we can make that work for everybody's benefit, not impact the Delta guys, both the growers and the environment, and, you know, Contra Costa Water District's got an intake on the Delta, and they worry about salt. So we got to figure out how to make the Delta work for everybody. And again, I think Scott's right. It's when it comes to that high flow condition. In the high flow condition, what are we looking to do? So I think, man, there's just a lot of really smart discussion here. I'm impressed. Good job, Laura. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Tommy. So Ellen mentioned the Bryant Kern Canal, and we've been talking about shovel-ready projects, and so the canal has some subsidence damage that is caused throughout the years. So we're hoping to slow down subsidence, but how do you correct something like that? How, from what I understand, water's gravity fed into the canal, and now that there's damage, can somebody educate us a little bit on how do you fix the infrastructure damage that has been caused because of subsidence?
So let me have a shot at that one first then. So I'm not totally familiar with that, but they have spent a lot of money looking at different alternatives, both like a separate canal and fixing the existing canal. I think what they've settled on now is essentially a series of pump stations to lift the water back up out of the subsided area. And so that's my understanding right now. There may be some other ways that we can help the problem through like a mid-valley canal that links back into the Bryant Kern Canal past the point of subsidence. The real problem here is how do you prevent the subsidence from continuing, right? So if we've got 20 years before that has to be fully implemented, we could have a lot more subsidence. The problem in the Bryant Kern Canal is substantial. Actually 2/3 of that capacity in that area in southern Tulare County. So it's going from essentially 4,500 second foot of capacity to 1,500 second foot of capacity. And that's really hurting the recharge capabilities of the districts in Kern County that rely on that capacity. So in terms of like a permanent fix, this is where we really need to get Delta water back into that area and get conveyance facilities so we can recharge that area and stop the subsidence from continuing.
Thank you, Scott. That sounds like it might be a good topic of presentation for future workshops and webinars. So I think we're at a good point where we could take a break so that the speakers can get a chance to grab some water and our guests are able to just walk around and take a quick break. So I want to leave you guys with 5 minutes of the Fresno State Jazz Band, and we will be back at 11:05.
All right.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to refresh your coffee, get some water, or just walk around, and did that while you enjoyed the Fresno State Jazz Band. The next conversation will be focused on some of the charges and some of the taxes, surcharges, and expenses to do with some of the investments that are needed. But a bigger conversation was, is this really a water conversation or a food conversation? It seems like they go hand in hand, regardless of your race, of your point of view, of your economic status, or even the location that you live in. As the valley feeds the world, water is going to affect everyone because it directly affects our food supply as ag production might decline. Any comments on how the water investments will affect the price of food?
Hey, Laura, this is Tommy. Okay. I mean, I think the investment in water infrastructure is going to absolutely impact the price of food. The question becomes, how much impact is it going to have? I think it's going to be a function of the stuff that Ellen's kind of working on, the supply and the demand. What's the sweet spot on the supply and the demand? And then that goes into the stuff that Scott's working on is, okay, what's the sweet spot for the infrastructure based on that supply and demand? And then we got to pay for it. And then however we decide to pay for it, I think you're right. And that'll probably have some impact on the food costs, what growers have to charge for food. So that's kind of what we looked at when we were doing this funding idea. So we looked at a lot of different ways. One of the ways we looked at was a water surcharge on growers. We looked at a parcel tax on growers. And then we looked at this sales tax as well. And so on the water tax, on growers, or the parcel tax, that certainly fits the beneficiary pays model, but it puts all the burden on the grower. And then that's going to impact the price of food, certainly. But again, like you said, we do this food thing that kind of feeds at least California, feeds the US, and gets some of it. So how might we distribute the benefit generated from the food cost? So that's kind of why we looked at that sales tax, because we got it off the growers' back and we put it in the economy. And again, food isn't taxed. So when you go to the grocery store buy food, that's not taxed there. So this is a sales tax that will apply to everything else you buy that's kind of taxable, with the idea being that, as David kind of pointed out, that, if we lose food production, that's directly correlated with the economic activity in the valley. And that's going to be job losses. That's going to be income losses. So everybody will kind of get impacted by that. So is there a way we could find a funding strategy that everybody could contribute to making it better for everybody? And that's why we kind of came on this sales tax idea. I mean, we're a unique place. We have food and we have water. I mean, those are the two things people have never figured out how to live without on this planet. And we got both from here. We just got to be smart and figure out how do we balance that with the environment, balance that with social equity issues, and be smart about it. I know we can do it. We just got to have more of a discussion about it. So that's kind of the thinking on our sales tax idea, was to get it out into a place where the general economy would participate in funding, because the general economy would benefit if we can arrest some of that production loss.
So Tommy, if I understood right, the surcharge will put a burden on the farmer, and that's what we don't want to do. And then you said that the sales tax is not on food, because we normally don't go to the grocery store and pay sales tax on some of our produce. So if we are paying for all of the sales tax on what the other items we consume, doesn't this seem like California is covering the burden to feed the world? Shouldn't the world have some impact in helping us fix our water infrastructure?
Yes, I would agree. I would agree 100%, absolutely. But I think if you had growers kind of call in on this event, they would tell you that, you know, the environmental stewardship that they do, again, people can question whether they, you know, what they do, but the environmental stewardship they do, the labor things that they're doing, the water things that they're doing, don't always get applied in other parts of the world that our growers compete with. So if we put those costs on our guys, you know, they're competing in a market that isn't always at a level playing field. So we just add cost to them. So that's why let's move the cost maybe to where the general economy can contribute to the infrastructure that keeps the agricultural thing going here. So I agree. I'd love for the world to pay, but the world ain't paying right now. So, you know, right now it's let's focus on the home team. The home team is the San Joaquin Valley. How do we get ourselves strong? Well, we'd certainly want some state funding. We'd love to get some federal funding, some greenhouse gas money, you know, and some other funds. But at the end of the day, you know, we should probably consider a way to pay for it ourselves, because I mean, we rely on this economy, this food system to kind of keep our economy going. Now, that's also an argument for the need to diversify the economy. So that's got to be a parallel effort we look at here in the Valley, is trying to diversify the economy so we don't have all our eggs in one fruit basket, if you will.
Literally a fruit basket. So I don't want to completely pick on Tommy, so anybody else on the panel is welcome to jump in. But how do we think, so Tommy provided some numbers on how we would think a 0.5% sales tax would be. What if that went higher? Like, how would that affect everybody? And how did anybody address the impact it's going to have on specifically the low-income families?
It can become kind of a regressive tax. The sales tax can, and the higher it becomes, the more regressive it can become, because it becomes a bigger financial burden on those who have less disposable income, less resources to pay.
Yeah, Tom's absolutely right. This is Tom. Yeah, Tom's absolutely right. That's always been a concern about doing it this way. And I think, you know, that's where we got to kind of look at the economics. So if we wind up as a regressive tax taking this amount of income out of, you know, low income people's pockets, what's that compared with the job losses that they may incur? And I mean, that's really how we got to, I don't want to say that's the only way to look at it, but that's really what's the economic loss if they don't have a job versus what's the economic loss if we have to take a half a cent out of every one of their transactions. I mean, that's how we'll have to evaluate it. I believe that's how we'll have to evaluate it. But it's absolutely a regressive tax. Yeah, no doubt.
I'm a little bit reluctant to jump in here because there are two people on this call that are much better economists than I am. But I'm, you know, this is, and I'm not making any particular recommendations here, but just sort of for the sake of conversation, I'm wondering or not, the farmers shouldn't bear more of the cost of improving the water supply. More back to a beneficiary pays. That's sort of where Tommy is essentially coming from. So there's this sort of question, well, who is the real beneficiary? Is it the people that eat the food, or is it the people that supply the food, right? And in reality, there's sort of a combination there. The valley is very mixed in, like the valley farmers, it's a very mixed sort of situation already. Districts that are paying that have paid a lot of money over a long period of time to establish their water supplies, but people right next to them outside of the district that haven't paid anything to sustain the water supplies. And so what's the equity there? And you know, is it unreasonable now for the people that haven't been paying anything for a long time to now start to step up and pay for it? On what it could do to the production. So we've got some commodities that can clearly afford to pay more for their water supply. And then we've got other commodities that are really struggling right now. And, you know, milk is sort of an interesting one because at the moment, as I understand it, it's a fairly low margin. So happens if we now impose essentially an additional, they actually have to pay, a significant portion of the cost to get new water supplies. I think what it does is force some milk producers out of production. That will then essentially put up the price of milk and help keep the rest of the producers in business. But now you're passing on like increased milk prices, to the consumer. So it all gets sort of fairly complicated fairly quickly. But I think, and I'm not a political analyst by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm thinking that we're going to have to, if we're going to ask people to pay a sales tax, that I think to stop this being totally regressive, that we're going to have to be looking to the farmers to pay, some portion of the bill.
David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's clearly a good rationale for farmers to pay part of the bill for this. But I think there's also a compelling rationale for the state to pick up a part of it as well. There are tremendous impacts beyond agriculture, and I'd point from keeping some farming going in the state, and I'd point to two areas. First, the impact on low-income communities of having farming leave the San Joaquin Valley, I think, is probably more than a lot of the state's residents are willing to bear. These are communities that already have significant challenges where half or more of the families are already below the poverty line. And the idea of taking tens of thousands of jobs out of those communities is, again, a place that I think the state probably does not want to go, and therefore would be willing to pay something to help contribute to a solution. The other point is that there are definitely consumer impacts from large-scale changes in farm activity in the San Joaquin Valley. There are certain commodities where all or virtually all of what US consumers, or a number of consumers around the world, are purchasing comes from the San Joaquin Valley. And when that's gone, maybe some of that production can be made up in other regions, but there's a lot of reason to suspect that prices will go up to some extent. And then there are ancillary impacts of changes in farming activity. So for a bunch of reasons, the state could almost look at this like a tax increment financing situation, where if we don't do something to shore up the agricultural base in the valley, the state's own tax revenues will go down. So again, I think clearly appropriate for the farmers to pay a share of whatever infrastructure solutions get put into place. But I also think there's a good public policy rationale for the state to pick up a piece of it as well.
Hey, David, can I ask you a little bit more about that? Is there, because I've always wondered about this, can this be, from the state's perspective, can this actually be viewed as an investment? In other words, the rationale for putting money into water infrastructure is because it increases the revenues throughout the state, the tax revenues throughout the state. Mm-hmm. And without it, they wouldn't have that tax revenue. Can you justify investment in this kind of infrastructure because it's a sensible investment for the state?
Yeah, and again, that's one of the rationales behind tax increment financing, which is something that we do in California and other jurisdictions. I think it's reasonable to expect, if there's fallowing on the scale, that PPIC has looked at, or we've looked at with some alternative assumptions. The state could be looking at the loss of several hundred million. We can argue about the exact amount, but 300 to 500 to 800 million per year in tax revenues. So yes, I think there is an investment case to be made.
Thanks.
I think there's a complete correlation between the two. If we invest our sales tax into water projects, this will happen. If we don't, this will happen. And either or will affect some of these communities. And so, Tom, you talked about yesterday about the JPAs and how it being a regional effort and the 8 counties. So what happens if one of the counties decides not to participate, or even related to the sales tax? What if it doesn't pass in one of the counties? Because we're looking at the 8 county as one, correct?
Well, having any kind of a hole in the regional governance system would be probably a significant problem. And that's to an extent, that's a political matter, trying to convince the leadership in each county or whatever jurisdictions we're talking about to participate. Actually, that David's talking about making a case to the state. One should also be trying to make a case to all the counties involved that they have a fundamental stake in this, and that they need to be on board and be team players on this, because losing any one of them would be a significant hurdle. It would really undermine the legitimacy of the whole project, I would think. And we've seen what's happened with existing JPAs, like Friant comes to mind from a few years ago. They started having members drop out when trying to deal with the San Joaquin River restoration.
So Tom, I just because I'm not that familiar with some of these things, could a county decide to participate, but a city within it not participate?
Well, yes. It's not required that counties and cities all participate. It seems to me, though, that the more you have on, the better, unless there's going to be intractable problems by having counties, cities, and other kinds of special districts involved. But the more you have in, the more political legitimacy you have, and possibly the more resources you have to draw on, because you can work with the taxing authorities in those jurisdictions to become part of the overall financing solution, or something to that effect.
Yeah. Yes. So Tommy, we talked about the sales tax, and it should be 8 county-wide. So what happens if there's a infrastructure project that affects multiple counties and the county right in the middle doesn't pass the sales tax?
Yeah, I mean that I think Tom nailed it. I mean, it just makes it very difficult to kind of implement and have to do workarounds. I mean, we see that kind of with Sigma right now, right? There's 21 basins, and we decided to create 108 GSAs. That complicates things when you got to work around and through, makes the institutional elements a little bit more challenging. It's not impossible, certainly not impossible, but it becomes a challenge if we got to get right of way through their property, or we're having to acquire land or do things like that. Those are challenges. Those are the kinds of activities that could get the ire of a local government that decided not to participate. But I just we got to do it together. I mean, we just got the power of them pooling their money together just generates a lot of buying capacity for the infrastructure they need.
Could I ask, I think maybe this is a question for Tommy and Tom. I was wondering, when you're thinking about some kind of infrastructure financing district or JPA, with a kind of pooled funding, are you thinking about, in the sales tax example, for instance, are you thinking about the sales tax increment being proposed to voters at each county level, or doing a regional thing? And an example you see in the Bay Area is when it comes to there are sometimes measures that are Bay Area wide for a land assessment or something like that.
Yeah, this is Tommy. I'll start first. So there's been a couple of ideas thought about. One is every man for himself, or every agency for themselves. 8 people go. It's common language, common messaging, but they all pursue it independently. The other one that was thrown out was the idea of working with the legislature to create a special 8 county something agency district, kind of like the Santa Ana Water Authority down there. That's a specially created district. Maybe have the legislature create that, and then that becomes the entity, and then they can just define all of within that they can define membership, voting, participation, all that stuff. So that's kind of my thoughts. What do you think, Tom?
Well, yeah, I would agree with that kind of an approach. If we're going to try to do it piecemeal, counties, cities, whatever, that's going to be a long, arduous process and probably leave a lot of holes.
So related to that, so Tom, educate me a bit on JPAs. So it's my understanding that there's multiple different types. And so is there one that would be the most beneficial for governing or equity, and a governing and equity standpoint, if you envision a program that has private public partnerships that require requiring terms and conditions and performance incentives? Are there different kinds, or is it going to be the one?
Well, a JPA can take on a variety of forms and have a variety of different kinds of member government agencies. It sort of depends on the kind of problem you're trying to deal with, on who you would bring in. My point was simply that we're dealing with, a regional problem that has where the problems emerge in an awful lot of different places. It's not just a matter of getting water to farmers. It's also a matter of being able to take care of the poorer communities also within the region, as well as a number of environmental concerns. If you're going to try to handle problems on that kind of a scale, then you're probably going to want different kinds of public agencies to be involved in the JPA, or I think a JPA plus an EIFD established underneath it. Actually, for an EIFD, you have to have cities and counties involved. Special districts can't do that alone. But it seems to me that the bigger the scale of the project, and I think we are contemplating a large-scale infrastructure project, then you need to have a variety of members in there to deal with a variety of problems. And I'll also point out that I'm not a true expert on the legal idiosyncrasies of JPAs.
Or if I could jump in here.
Really?
This is so the governance issue here is tricky and complex. And I'm not really a favor of big government, personal philosophy, and the idea that you can, the closer that you can make the people paying the bills to the people making the decisions, I think the better the governance is. So when it comes to applying that, there's a couple of different JPAs that I'm familiar with, and one of which I'm actually the executive director of. And the way that we have structured that is that we've got like an umbrella JPA. And then within that, we have essentially project agreements, so that any individual participant in the JPA can decide whether or not they want to participate in the project. And the decisions in that project are made in proportion to the financial contribution to the project. And similarly, the voting is done the same way. So the people that pay are the people that make the decisions. So when it comes to this kind of a situation where we're thinking about, like, let's suppose it's like a mid-valley canal. So the entities that want to participate that and have a say in how it's going to be designed and built and funded are the ones that like step up to the table and voluntarily agree, to participate and contribute funds. And they essentially then take all the risk. So for the most part, that works pretty well. Back to the question of, well, what happens if somebody doesn't participate? And that's a difficult, so you've got a situation, for example, where let's suppose that you've got the landowners in a particular area participating, but the county decides not to participate, right? So that's then shifting the burden and maybe giving those farmers there, putting them in a much more difficult position than in other counties. So that's something that's still got to be addressed, but that model has worked really pretty well in our area. And I could see some version of it working here. It does require, you talked about a public-private partnership, right? So JPAs don't work for public-private partnerships. Private entities cannot be part of a JPA. What that really means is that the landowners, if the landowners wanted to participate, like white area landowners that aren't organized into a water district, they really need to form a water district to be able to participate. You could do it under the JPA, but then they don't really have as much control over their own destiny. I think it would be much better for them to form their own water district. That's going to help, you know, when it goes out to get sort of public money to finance the infrastructure, those kind of public entities have much more recourse to make sure that all of the financial payments are made, and therefore they get a lower bonding rate as a result of that. So, you know, so there are mechanisms by which everybody can participate, but we, you know, that's one of the things that we're going to have to start working on if we're going to pursue that kind of a path. But it does have a lot of potential.
Actually, Scott, just a quick question. Has the idea that some members of the JPA would choose not to participate, that has not created resentment amongst other members who maybe feel that costs are not being equally shared?
Well, then they don't get any of the benefits, Tom, if they don't participate. So essentially, if they didn't participate in the canal, they wouldn't get any of the water from the canal.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much for all of that information and for just all of those thoughts. In an interest of time, for our guests, if we didn't get to your question, we'll make sure that our staff reaches back out to the speakers, or if we have the information in our arsenal, that we reply to you and get you that answer. But I wanted to do just a quick last minute closing remarks for each of the speakers, and I will do one by one based on how you are on my screen. And just any closing thoughts on how do we fund the water infrastructure in the San Joaquin Valley? So sorry to pick on you, but you're the first one on my screen. So Tom?
Oh, me, okay.
Sorry.
Oh, I think, well, first off, this is something that really clearly, I think, needs to be done. I think we have pretty good understanding of what a lot of the problems are. And I just would like to really see it solved in as holistic as a manner as possible. And I think sometimes the tendency to get fixated on, you know, water for farms and, you know, production of food, and really the problems, and that's a significant problem to be sure, but the problems are, you know, much greater and much more widespread than that, and pretty well interconnected. So therefore, I think we need a true regional and holistic solution.
Thank you, Tom. Scott?
Well, let me start by thanking Fresno State and the California Water Institute for putting this on. It's been a really interesting several days for me here. And I really appreciate what Tommy Esqueda's done in terms of like starting to think about how we're going to finance something as big as this, and really appreciate some of the innovative ideas that he's been thinking about and the conversation that has been started here. So that's been great. I guess I would just say, look, I'm still looking at this as a process, and that we need to have a lot more conversations like this and think through a lot more of the issues so we can come up with a plan that really does work for everybody.
Thank you, Scott. Ellen?
So I'm just going to echo Scott and thank you, Laura, for an awesome job of herding cats and moderating over the last few days. And thanks also to Tommy and the fellow panelists and the Fresno State Jazz Band.
Yeah.
that was a nice flair to add to this event. You know, I think these are great early conversations about how to think about this as a regional approach. And, you know, funding is a piece of it. Governance is obviously a key piece of it too, and it's about water infrastructure, but it's also about, you know, just kind of planning for the future, both water and land, and doing that in some new ways that reflect the new realities. Personally, I think that what's going to be the best solution from a funding perspective is a mix. And, you know, in California, traditionally, water users have paid the majority of the costs of using water, and you can really think about water as an input into farming, just like labor, just like inputs of other types. And And so let's not, when the hard decisions are going to come down to what are the relevant shares of who should pick up what share. It's important for agriculture to have some skin in the game on this, I think, as well as other contributions.
Thank you, Ellen. David?
Yeah, well, let me start by thanking everyone. The portions of this conference that I've participated in have been great, and we've had some really good and I think pertinent discussions. I think it's probably come across in a number of ways, but the Valley does face some very significant challenges with respect to water scarcity going forward. And in some ways, the last major piece of water infrastructure that we had constructed in the Valley was the State Water Project. What we're talking about now with SIGMA implementation plus some anticipated surface water reductions is bigger than that by far, but working in the other direction. So the chance for real economic dislocation and hardship, I think, is very real, not to end this on a bummer note. And I believe that there are mitigation strategies out there that can help to relieve the pain and end up with a set of land uses in the Valley that works for a lot of people. But I think the chance for a bad result is there as well. And so I hope this discussion has focused attention on how important these issues are. I do believe the solutions are out there, but it'll take some work and creativity to get there. But it's a worthy problem for all of us to be thinking about.
Thank you, David. And last but not least, Tommy.
Yes, so I agree with everything everybody said. Just hasn't been said by everybody, so I'm gonna take a shot. No, I think I like where we are in the Valley right now with these discussions. Like I said earlier, we got Ellen working that supply demand question. We got to get that dialed in. Scott's doing, and then we got the economics of what those numbers look like that David's been able to provide. What might the infrastructure look like? Scott's working that. Holyoke, how might we govern this thing? And then, we got to pay for it. How might we pay for it? So I think all the pieces are being discussed that we need to be discussing. We just got to get everybody around the table working together on it at the same time. But I think these are the major things. And again, I don't know if the sales tax is the right idea, but it is an idea. Again, trying to allocate, we got about 40 million a year coming out of the growers on their side, some greenhouse gas money, and then the sales tax for the broader community. I think there's some, again, and those can be moved a lot of different ways. It's just got to start having that discussion how we want to do that. So great job, Laura. Great job. And great job to everybody who participated. This was really cool.
Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us over the week. Your time is truly appreciated and your knowledge. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us this week. I want to remind or just let you know that you'll be receiving a link to a survey. It looks like this virtual world is here for a while, and the California Water Institute would like to continue educating on important water issues. And so we'd love your feedback on how this week went and what we can do to make it better. And you will also receive links to all of the videos. If you've registered for the event, you will get the link this afternoon or early tomorrow morning, as well as link to the PowerPoint presentations, but they will not be open to the public until sometime next week. So if you're sharing them, just let them know that if they didn't register, that they'll get them next week. We'd also love to hear what some of the topics are that you'd like us to address. I will now turn it over the stage to Codie, our current interim director for the California Water Institute. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for an excellent job. I echo the panelists. You've done a fantastic job moderating and putting this all together, and we really appreciate it. Just to remind you that CWI at present state is committed to its mission to address the water needs of the San Joaquin Valley through education, outreach, and research. To that end, CWI will continue working towards the implementing the steps we need to complete in order to fund water infrastructure in the San Joaquin Valley. And we see those as, first, creating a shared vision for water in the valley, critical to the future, and we need to engage all the stakeholders, which we know will be incredibly difficult. But if it were easy, it probably would have already been done. So we are committed to helping implement and make that happen. Number two, as all has been discussed, we need to complete a capital development plan so that we know how to guide that vision for the valley's water system.
Codie, can you get closer to your microphone, please?
Yeah, how's this?
Better.
And thirdly, we need to create a governing structure with a funding mechanism so that we can complete the vision for the valley. All these steps are incredibly critical to water infrastructure in the valley, and CWI at present stage is committed to move through this process. Before we go, I have a couple of announcements. One is we have a publication, the San Joaquin Valley Water System Investment Program, which will provide much of the detail covered in these presentations over the last couple of days. That will be available to the public in the coming weeks. Please keep an eye out for our announcement of its availability. Remember that all the presentations, as Laura has said, are available to you through CWI's YouTube channel. Finally, we do invite you to continue to network using the Slack channel today. Again, on behalf of CWI and Fresno State for attending this summit, we appreciate your time and your investment and your engagement. And that's it for this conference. Thank you. Goodbye.